Free speech, or the right to express your opinions without censorship or restraint, is a core principle of modern democracies.
Almost everyone, from the far left to the far right, seems to agree on this, and yet, throughout history, it has been endlessly argued over, particularly during times of extreme division.
At such moments, questions are asked: what is free speech really? What separates it from hate speech, or treason, or incitement to violence? And who gets to decide?
Questions around free speech are never far from the political agenda, but once again they have dominated the media during this last week, both in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk in Utah in the USA, and the large, rowdy free speech rally in central London.
So, in this episode of Instant Classics, we're going to look at the place where free speech is often at least thought to have originated as a civic, democratic ideal, 5th century Athens. We think of 5th century Athens as a place where rational argument replaced political violence, but we're going to ask, is that really true? And we're going to think about free speech and its limits in Athens and a little bit in ancient Rome. How was free speech conceptualised in the ancient classical world? How fragile was it? How robust? And what kind of political backdrop did it emerge from?
This is Instant Classics, the podcast that uncovers the ancient stories still shaping the modern world. I'm Mary Beard.
And I'm Charlotte Higgins. Each week we dive into the myths, dramas and characters of the classical world to discover what they still mean to us now.
This episode, Freedom of Speech and Ancient History.
So I want to go back, Mary, with you to 5th century Athens. And I think people think of free speech as being as starting in 5th century democratic Athens. So let's say, if we think about 5th century Athens, democracy kind of emerges out of a period of political instability. It emerges not in a necessarily particularly linear way, but it does sort of become the political system that lasts for a couple of hundred years. We're not talking about the whole of Greece, far from it. So different cities in different parts of Greece had their own political systems. Democracy is particularly associated with ancient Athens, but this is a very different kind of democracy from the democracy that we think about today. This is a direct democracy rather than a representative or parliamentary democracy. This is a democracy that is participatory. It's an eyeball-to-eyeball democracy where people are physically present. It is available, this participation is available to free Athenian male citizens, which is, by our standards, a very small number of people, 20 to 30,000 people. And those people would have the opportunity to get together in an assembly, several thousand at a time, and put their points of view. And at least theoretically, anybody, any of these male free citizens could put their point of view, whether rich or poor. And thus it is, in a sense, that free speech is baked into this political system, because the equality of the opportunity to speak, which is known as Isegoria, is absolutely part of this political setup.
It goes along with another kind of very important concept, even slogan in classical Athens, which is Parrhesia, the right to say anything. And that's often translated as the right of freedom of speech. But I think a lot of people who've been working on the history of classical Athens recently have wanted to say that sounds a bit passive, that I've got the freedom to say what I want, that parrhesia is really the ability to be frank. Parrhesia is frank speech. Now, I'm somebody who thinks actually there probably hasn't been a time in human history, since people could speak when they haven't debated these issues. But in the West, we see this first, and it becomes something that we can kind of get a hold of in 5th century Athens, in the democracy. And, I think a very nice symbol of that is that one of the Athenian state triremes, actually, because Athenian boats were named and ships were named just like ours are. One was named Parrhesia. So you've got this Athenian trireme, it's kind of warship, named Frank Speech, going sailing out.
Which it kind of suggests, I think, that's such a great detail that you're naming a ship sort of Frank Speech, which is also, there's the kind of right to be insulting. Okay, Parrhesia is the right to speak truth to power.
Yes.
To be scatological, insulting, ferocious in your speech to powerful people. And that's, we have the HMS Victory, they have the HMS Frank Speech.
HMS Insult.
Yes, exactly. That shows you how key these concepts are to Athenian democracy. Although I think it's kind of worth saying, I mean, without getting into the weeds of how democracy was established in Athens, for me, I have a slight anxiety about people sitting down and thinking, these are the ideals around which we're going to build our new democracy. Democracy emerges in a curious way in Athens, perhaps arguably as a very pragmatic response to political instability, political violence, and single person rule. I don't know what you think, Mary, but I don't know to what extent these are ideals rather than pragmatic solutions to political problems.
I think it's a mixture. But that's the easy way out, isn't it? It's part great ideals, it's part what you name your battleship after, it's part how the democracy in real time arose, thanks to whose contributions and on what terms. I think, though, if we were to time travel, if we were to go back to 5th century Athens, I think at first sight we would have a bit of a shock. I mean, I think that we would find, people saying things to each other or in theatrical performances that we would think, gosh, you couldn't get away with that in 21st century Britain. You go to, Athenian comedy, one of the great, citizenly, theatrical, partly religious rituals, and you'll find that it's no holds barred on the sex life of any leading politician in a way that I think would make us squirm in our seats a bit.
Yes, so you can see in plays like Aristophanes' Knights, really incredibly, we would now say kind of obscene, extremely fruity, sexually explicit descriptions of people doing stuff that we can't actually really go to on this podcast, or else we'll be classified as explicit, and we don't really want that. But let it just be said that this play involves a sausage seller. I'll just leave that to your imagination, and involves a thinly disguised portrait of one of the leading politicians of the day, Cleon.
So there certainly looks as if first impression is that this is a free-for-all. You can say what you want. Now, I think what's interesting is that, if we stayed more than a day or so, we would see that it was more complicated than that. And these apparently utterly free Athenians were also having debates about who could speak, who couldn't, where the limits lay. Just, we don't recognise them instantly because they don't quite follow our problems.
I mean, in terms of the sort of sense of whether it was celebrated as a virtue and as something special about Athens, I do think that we have got one interesting piece of evidence, don't we, which is there was a historian, Herodotus, who wrote about the attempted invasion of Greece by the Persian Empire, so massive empire to the east. And he wrote and claimed that it was It was to do with the equality of speech that the Athenians had among the Isegoria, this equal ability to speak that helped them achieve this very unlikely victory against a superpower from the east, because there was a sense that there was something in it for everybody. They weren't just going to be fighting on behalf of a single person ruler, a tyrant. They were going to, everybody had a stake in the, now whether he's just, whether this is actually true or whether it's sort of it's part of what's emerging as a kind of ideology of democracy, is hard to understand. But it's a really interesting thing that he wrote.
Beard the Skeptical, which says, well, quite how far was that borne out, on the streets, in the assembly? It's fine to have the ideal of everybody has an equal right to participate. Now, kind of yes and no. I mean, I think it's important that it's an ideal, but you can pick up various hints in ancient Greek and ancient Athenian literature that it was more complicated. That, I mean, I'm now going to go back into the mythical world of the Trojan War and to the poetry of Homer, so-called, who, let's say composed in the 8th century BCE, long before the Athenian democracy. But there's an extraordinary scene near the beginning of Homer's Iliad, which tells story, a part of the Trojan War, where they're having a debate. The Greeks, the invading forces, trying to capture Troy, are having a debate. It's a sort of mini assembly, it looks like. And one working class guy, as it were, we would say, gets up and speaks and says some pretty powerful things to King Agamemnon, some good criticism. The description of this guy in Homer is that he's kind of bullish, he's a sort of frightful thug, he isn't one of us. And in the end, the hero Odysseus, who's part of this debate, actually pulls him down and thrashes him for speaking. Now, you could say, well, that's just the mythic past. You got people in Athens thinking, oh, well, that's the bad old days when ordinary people like me couldn't get up and speak. But there it is as a scene in, perhaps the most important work of Greek literature ever composed.
Yeah, it's really an interesting and amazing passage, because this is like an ordinary soldier saying exactly what ordinary soldiers, I think, have thought a lot throughout history, which is our leaders are getting this wrong. This is a disaster. We should just, this war isn't justified, and we should go back home before we get killed. And he's as you said, like, he's described as sort of not only thuggish, but there's like ugly, everything. And yet, if you sort of place him in a 5th century rather than an 8th century Athenian context, he ought to be the ideal of, like, anyone can get on their hind legs in the assembly and say what they think. I don't know about you, Mary, but I've been in a lot of like all staff meetings, let's say, and where anyone has the right to speak. But we know that in those contexts, anyone will know that in that kind of context where theoretically anyone's allowed to speak, that's only half true. There may be all sorts of reasons why some people speak more than other people.
And there's a lovely or horrible example recounted by Xenophon, writer of the 4th century BCE, and now well into the time where we know what freedom of speech is. And it's about a young man called Glaucon. And Glaucon wants to make his mark in the assembly. He sort of tries to do that, but he's very bad at speaking. He's had no lessons in how to speak. And so this, 20-year-old is just pulled off the speaker's platform. He gets up to try to speak to the assembled Athenians, just as he ought to be able to do if we're thinking that everybody has an equal right to speak. But they pull him down. It's kind of like the equivalent of smashing him with tomatoes, but tomatoes weren't part of the Greek cuisine. He's just removed. And, you think there's presumably all kinds of exemplary lessons like that. That yes, you've got a theoretical right to speak, but only if you can do it well.
Yeah.
And how do you do it well? You have to
Get
be
a
trained.
teacher. Get a teacher.
Get a teacher.
And the culture of being trained in rhetoric, the theory of how to speak persuasively in Athens, which is the thing. This face-to-face democracy runs on the petrol of speech. So being able to speak well in the assembly or in other political arenas in Athens is how to get things done. And there's a huge amount of literature and a huge amount of anxiety expressed in Athenian sources about teachers of rhetoric coming into the city, often from outside, teaching rich aristocratic young men how to be super persuasive. And out of this, we get this whole idea of demagogues as well. I mean, demagogue is a Greek word.
Leader of the people.
And the sort of idea of populist people with a silver tongue, those people who are able to make the worst argument seem like the better argument. These teachers of rhetoric are known often as sophists, so that they have a kind of, they're sort of philosophers, teachers of speaking, teachers of argument, and there's a lot of anxiety about it, isn't there?
It seriously undermines the notion that everybody has the same right to speak as anyone else. And I think that comes out when you think not only of Isegoria, but also of Parrhesia, frankness of speech. There's a lot of quite sophisticated discussion in rhetorical theory in the ancient world about what are the limits? If you get up and you speak frankly, but it's a lie, how are we supposed to react to that? To put it another way, do you have the freedom to speak falsehoods?
Yes.
And that is something that, we are, that's never gone away. We now face, do you have the freedom to speak falsehoods?
Yes. But in a very, very different way, because freedom of speech in the modern era is often organised around the idea of censorship by a government of the ability to speak freely by the people. That's not really how it works in ancient Athens, largely because there is no government in the modern sense. This is the direct face-to-face democracy thing where the government is the people. It's certainly not a world in which social media is creating a whole different environment for information or misinformation exchange, which is set against, as it were, a government system.
I mean, the important thing is that these issues of truth and falsehood, etc., and who you choose to believe and on what terms you choose to believe them, because that's the other side of freedom of speech. It's who you choose to trust, right? And that's just as important. Those are actually dealt with and fought out face to face. Now, sometimes, and I think it's terribly important to remember this, sometimes they are literally fought out. So I think there is a kind of romantic myth about classical Athens in particular, that it was a place where rational argument between one citizen and another had replaced violence, that it was a peaceful place where people just hammered things out in a respectful way in words. Now, actually, I think the one thing that we often forget about classical Athens is that the democracy of Athens was a very contested, violent democracy. And you can find example after example of people, quote, on the other side, being taken out, murdered, assassinated. And that goes right through the period of Athenian democracy. You've got a radical politician called Ephialtes, who's assassinated in 461 BC. Nobody knows by whom, but it's thought that it was a conservative assassination. In the middle of the Peloponnesian War, the whole democracy was shelved in 411 when Athens wasn't doing too well in its battles against Sparta. They actually shelved democracy and had a basic, oligarchy. And in some ways, most notoriously, at the end of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens has lost its great struggle with Sparta, with a bit of Spartan help, a horrible junta is installed in Athens called, rather euphemistically, the 30 or the 30 tyrants, who really have a kind of brutal, cleansing, murderous campaign of getting rid of Democrats in the city. And I think that we shouldn't ever get the idea that somehow being able to speak and discuss is necessarily the kind of single sole answer to violence. It might be part and parcel, as it was in Athens, of violence. I mean, I don't think there is a real lesson for us here. I'm not sure there are any real lessons that we can directly take from Athens. But I think it's quite helpful to, just to examine the conflicts and the difficulties and the sometimes rather unpalatable aspects of freedom of speech in ancient Athens.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing we could usefully do, Mary, today, it's eradicate the idea of a kind of golden age of free speech in which people wearing long flowing cloaks walked around the agora of Athens debating in a very civilized way with each other and working everything out, perfectly, because that's just not what it was like. And quite often Athenian democracy, as fragile as it was and as short-lived as it was and as interrupted, as you said, by these periods of oligarchy, so, ruled by a few, literally, oligarchy, they also made the wrong decision quite often. This whole system comes under huge pressure when Athens is at war with Sparta, another Greek city.
That's the Peloponnesian War that I mentioned a bit casually.
Exactly so, and things get very fraught and very difficult under those war conditions, especially when Athens is doing badly, right? And the historian who wrote about that rather nasty, vicious war, Thucydides, gives some very vivid accounts of the Athenian assembly deciding one thing, go off and kill all the inhabitants of a town across the Aegean called Mytilene, and then another assembly being rapidly convened, and the assembly deciding, oh gosh, no, let's not do that, and sending off another ship to try and overtake the first ship to stop them from massacring all the people in this town and Mytilene. In that case, to us, looking back at this, it looks like the right answer was reached, but actually sort of for the wrong reasons in a funny way. And the arguments presented by Thucydides seem to be suggesting to us that he felt there was something a bit wrong with this democracy, that the good arguments weren't always winning, or the bad arguments might win for the wrong reason. But anyway, this is all becoming very messy. It's all becoming very, very messy.
Yeah. And, I think if there is a lesson for me in all this, the combination of fierce argument, of, civilized argument maybe, but also violence and violent conflict, the message is that the Athenian democracy constantly had to fight for itself. Democracy isn't something that lands on you and then you can say, oh, fine, right, we've now reached it and we can sit back and enjoy democracy. Democracy is something that you have to work really, really hard at. And I wonder if we haven't forgotten, honestly, that democracy is something that needs to be worked on, not just something that you get and enjoy. But I think that the case we've been skirting around a bit, and it comes directly in the slipstream of the very nasty junta that was imposed on Athens at the very end of the 5th century, at the very end of the Peloponnesian War, so-called 30 tyrants, nasty thugs, every single one of them, is, of course, the case of the death of the philosopher Socrates.
Who is, as far as most people are concerned, I think, the great martyr for freedom of speech. Yes. But would you agree with that, Mary?
Well, you know what I'm going to say. Go on, Charlotte. And I'm going to say it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, I think that the basics are very easy to understand. Socrates is a philosophical gadfly in 5th century Athens. He's going round, he's challenging people to think about what they really believe, how the state should be run. He doesn't write anything down. This really is kind of face-to-face philosophy. And he's asking people to think the unthinkable. He happens, and this I think is going to be important, he happens to have been great mates. He was no Democrat. Socrates, no Democrat at all, and he happens to be great mates with a large number of the 30 tyrants who made up the junta. A few years later, after the junta has been overthrown, Socrates is put on trial, and the main charges are corrupting the youth of the city and dishonouring the traditional gods and introducing new gods. I mean, Socrates was widely reputed, and he himself admitted, to have a thing about his kind of spirit, his daimon. He was much less keen on Athena and Zeus than he was on this slightly odd form of daimonia, right? And he's put on trial. And there's a jury, as there often is in Athens, really big jury, 501. The case is very split. They vote for conviction. They vote him guilty. But if just 30 people out of that 501 had gone the other way, he would have got off. And he's sentenced to death. Now, according to the conventions of Athens at the time, actually, if he'd played ball and said, can I suggest maybe a kind of plea bargain here, exile, I'll leave the city, but he won't. And so he embraces the death penalty. And we have a very famous scene described by his pupil Plato of him eventually taking the poison, the hemlock, in prison that will enact the death penalty. And it's easy to see, it's very easy to see how you can spin that story to be, Socrates the martyr to free speech. He'd gone around asking awkward questions, being a bit difficult, saying, think about this again, everybody, being a bit of, a bit of an uncomfortable gadfly for most people. And he is put to death for it. And that's partly right. But I don't know what you think, but I think there are more things to this.
He is tried on 2 charges, one of which is introducing new gods to Athens, and the other of which is corrupting the youth. So actually, he's not tried on freedom of speech precisely. Plenty of people have argued quite convincingly, actually, that at least in terms of what he was charged for, he was guilty of. We think of introducing new gods to Athens maybe as trivial because we don't believe in Zeus and Athena, not many of us anyway, any longer.
Yeah, so it all seems a bit silly.
But actually, introducing new gods to Athens was quite a serious and important thing, and it's a kind of almost atheistic, potentially. I mean, one could argue about this, but Socrates is going way off piste in terms of religion. I mean, so were plenty of philosophers, so it's quite hard to.
Yeah, but when push comes to shove, though, this is kind of radical treason almost. That the Athenian state depends on its relationships with the traditional gods. That's what an Athenian, an ordinary, quotes, Athenian citizen was likely to say, that the gods of the city are absolutely central to the survival and the flourishing of the city. The city needs its gods. Socrates comes along and says, well, don't bother with Hera and Athena and Zeus, have my daimonion then, my little spirit. That's not just a kind of quaint bit of theological debate. It is about attacking one of the main foundations of the Athenian state. I mean, in that sense, introducing new gods is kind of I do think it's treason. And they were divided, like I think many of us are, but they came down on the side of guilt.
Corrupting the youth is, of course, is a very interesting topic. And as you say, that, we've already talked about this kind of culture of sophists teaching young aristocratic men who could afford it how to make the weak arguments overcome the strong arguments. I'm rephrasing an ancient author there, but what a threat that kind of rhetorical skill could be. And although Socrates absolutely denied being, as it were, one of them, I am not a sophist is sort of a key part of Socrates' sort of self fashioning, at least as we understand it from the people who wrote about him, his pupils who wrote about him. I think, seen in certain lights, he could be classed alongside these threatening sophists who taught young men how to be able to manipulate the political system in their own favour, basically.
And manipulating the political system meant deceiving people with speech. Not informing them, but deceiving. And that's, again, it's the boundary between Parrhesia and lying. And Socrates must have seemed to sit very difficultly, awkwardly, on the tightrope. And, if you then say, well, how did they turn out? Well, actually, they turned out, many of them, to be the worst and most murderous kind of narrow, oligarchic, junta-like politicians.
Yeah, and we're not talking about Plato here, although Plato, that's a whole different story. We're talking about pupils of his who went on to have aristocrats who went on to have a big political role, and not in a good way, arguably. No, in a very violent, unpleasant way.
I think it is that whole period of Athenian history, from the establishment of the junta in 404, and then it is brought down, it's changed in 403, after which what's really interesting is that there was an amnesty, that what the Athenians decided was not to have a witch hunt against those people who had murdered large numbers of citizens, but they called it a day. I think, though, it's not unconnected that just a few years later, 399, they get Socrates on something a bit different, but you can't get away from the background of the horrific violence that this junta had carried out. And, and the Athenians had it been an absolute model of how to come together after civil strife. It was just an amnesty. We're going to try to get back. We're going to forget that.
Yeah, year zero, and a kind of modified version of democracy is brought in right at that point. Yeah. It doesn't last forever because, unfortunately, the Macedonians come along and conquer Greece. Yes. But it lasts for a bit.
Yeah, and to some extent, Socrates, you might see him as a scapegoat. That doesn't justify the killing, but I think you can't look at that moment where a brilliant but deeply irritating anti-democrat who refused to compromise was put on trial and actually himself opted to accept the death penalty when he could have gone to Thebes. He could have gone to exile somewhere else, but he chose not to. Now, in some ways, of course, saying he chose not to is part of that. And his image as martyr. He was not going to say, "I'll take the easy way out. I'm going to sit here." And at one stage we have a version of the speech that he gave in his own defence, largely, I suspect, invented by Plato, but it's a version. And at one point, he makes it a joke. He says, I think what I should have free meals at the state's expense for life for what I've done. And you think at this point, the authorities, saying, you are a disruptor in a state who has just decided that they will not let those kind of things disrupt them. They've had the amnesty. You are, this is more than we can take.
Yeah, he pushed them too far.
I am not justifying, let me make it clear, the death penalty for Socrates. No, I'm not. But if you try to think back to what might have prompted it.
Fun fact, that text is called Plato's Apology. By the way, it is not Socrates apologizing for being annoying. It's a self-defense, it's a self-justification, but it's always kind of amusing that the word apology has kind of changed its meaning. But it's definitely not Socrates saying sorry.
Apologia in ancient Greek meant defense. It was Socrates' defense. But it is, so you do get the impression, you think, oh, Socrates' speech, and it's called Socrates' apology. You think, you go through it, thinking, when's he going to apologise?
It's like, I was right.
And then it's I was right all along. We spent all this time talking about 5th century Athens, and I don't think 5th century Athens was remotely typical of the Greek world. I mean, I'm not sure what the issue of free speech in Sparta was, and we don't actually know, but we can't necessarily think that this transferred to anywhere else. And of course, not very far away is the image of Rome.
Yeah, which certainly does not have. I mean, in our imaginations, Athens is the sort of ground zero of free speech, and Rome is very far from that, because we think of civil war, we think of emperors, we think of treason trials, we think of people being violently put to death for questioning the emperor. But maybe we can make a case for some moments of freedom of speech, or at least
we can make a case for them thinking harder about it than we ever allow them. In the popular imagination, we think of the wicked emperor, telling somebody to kill themselves because they've criticised the emperor. That certainly does happen. I'm not whitewashing this, but I think that within that culture, they were having both similar and different questions about what freedom of speech meant, which were, in fact, I think, quite sophisticated and important. I mean, my favourite example, I think, happens in the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, and it's in 25 CE. And there's a guy, a historian called Cremutius Cordus, who is up for trial because, and you can see this is total kind of face out with free speech. He has written a history of Rome in which he has praised Brutus and Cassius, who assassinated Julius Caesar. Now, Tiberius, the reigning emperor, essentially owes his position to the figure of Julius Caesar, and Cremutius Cordus has praised them as saying that Cassius was the last true Roman. And the case comes to trial in the Senate. Now, I think it's quite hard for us again to get the seriousness of this. I mean, it's a bit like saying Socrates didn't really go along with Athena and Zeus, how quaint. In this case, you might say, and I'm pushing this a bit further, but it might be like someone having written a history of Britain in the 20th century, making Hitler the hero, right? There is that the assassins of Julius Caesar, are absolutely one serious threat to the whole kind of regime of Rome. So it's big news. Cremutius Cordus makes, he also has his apologia, like in the Senate. He's already decided that he's going to kill himself at the end. He's going to starve himself to death, which is what he does. He goes into bat, and he first said, look, other people have praised Brutus and Cassius. And look, actually, he says, and this is a kind of bit of a feeble argument, I think, they're dead anyway, right? You can, it's, why do we bother about what we say about the dead? It's the living that counts. And then he also says, and this is closer to coming to our ideas and problems of free speech, that you're attacking my words. There's nothing about, you don't need to attack me. I can be innocent, but on trial here are the words that I wrote, which have a kind of independent existence. Surprise, surprise, he's sentenced, he's found guilty. And he goes, I don't know whether a death penalty is formally decreed, but, he goes home to kill himself, while some of the magistrates in Rome insist that all the copies of his books should be burnt. Right, it's slightly ironic, I have to say, that his name, Cremutius Cordus, actually means burning. And so quite how that happened, I don't know. But
Nominative determinism, unfortunately.
nominative determinism, I'm wanting something to be burnt. And so there's a bonfire of Cremutius Cordus's books, except, and this is always the trouble with book burning, if you're a book burner, it's very hard to get every copy. And in fact, the truth is that Cremutius Cordus's work does survive, because one story says his daughter kept a copy, and it is still there to be quoted by later authors. Now you might say, but we don't have it, so in the end Tiberius got his way, and we can't read the history of Cremutius Cordus. But you can see there, the difficulty of, can you actually ever destroy someone's words? Well, it's much harder than you think.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting example. But I would make the case for Marcus Tullius Cicero, great Roman statesman, as a martyr for free speech, actually. So Cicero was a politician during this extraordinarily violent and turbulent period at the end of the Roman Republic, as the Roman Republic is kind of collapsing, and out of which will emerge the emperors. But this is a period of extreme political violence and strife. And Cicero is a philosopher, a lawyer, a statesman. He makes a series of speeches violently attacking Mark Antony. He's one of obviously the chief players in this political violence that ends with the emergence of the man who will become known as the Emperor Augustus. And he's murdered for those speeches. Cicero's head his decapitated head ends up being displayed on the rostrum, which is the sort of speaking podium from which politicians spoke in the centre of Rome. And his tongue is run through with a hairpin by Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony. So it's so gruesome, but I invite you to imagine this, Mary, as I'm sure you've done many times, the decapitated head of poor old Cicero, his tongue sort of hanging out, and Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, running a hairpin through his tongue. Now that is the most vivid and kind of confronting and upsetting, actually, image of violence to the actual tongue. That the sort of sense that, she wants to punish even the dead organ of speaking of this man. It's so full of heavy symbolism. It's so crude and violent and so, as eloquent, as it were. Paradoxically eloquent in its way, of this guy, we killed him because of what he said.
In some ways, slightly unfashionable it would be to say, that is a much more powerful version of an assault on free speech than the trial of Socrates is. I think that, you can disagree with Cicero, you can find him, he's on the wrong side. But what happens to him is he is attacked in his organ of speaking. And for me, that's such a chilling case and ought to be better known.
And I think, I've been reflecting while we've been talking, Mary, and this episode is something that we obviously decided to do very much on the hoof, because free speech has been so much part of the news agenda in the past week, and it has had such sort of violent and troubling consequences both in America and the UK. I don't think, and I wonder if you agree with me, Mary, I don't think there's anything that we can, I'm not sure we can say, well, we've got three lessons for you from ancient Greece and Rome to help us navigate this extraordinarily upsetting and febrile, difficult moment in global politics. But I do think that sometimes thinking about this stuff at a distance, in these far off places called Greece and Rome, where arguments, both similar and quite different, were happening, can actually help us in a way to think about our own moment, but not in a direct way, but actually in an indirect way.
Yeah. They give us a different perspective on our own questions. As you say, some of the questions are the same, some are different. And to quote a now hackneyed phrase, I think that the ancient world does kind of open up for us a safe space. I mean, where we can discuss this. This all happened 2,000 years ago. No one's going to get hurt, and we can look at it with a constructive distance, which may help us think. It'll help us think harder about our own issues. It won't give us 3 takeaway points and an answer, but it will help us think harder.
I think that's a great place to say goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. And please, if you have any questions, comments, remarks of any kind, do get in touch with us.
Let us know your thoughts on our email, instantclassicspod@gmail.com, or on our socials. If you want ad-free listening and access to the Instant Classics Book Club, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get yours. And why not leave us a rating or review too? It really helps more people find the show. Bye.
Bye-bye.